Latin America is arguably the most richly endowed developing region of the world, with vast areas of fertile land, abundant water resources, the largest remaining rainforests in the world, the rich harvest of its oceans, and plentiful mineral resources including oil, gas, copper, iron ore, and silver, among others. The strong natural endowment, proximity to, and close business ties with North America and Europe, and relatively advanced institutional and physical infrastructure contributed, until the 1970s, to high economic growth. By 1980, most Latin American economies joined the ranks of middle-income societies, well before Asia. In 1980, Latin America's per capita GDP was almost 10 times that of East Asia. Latin America was generally regarded as the developing region with the greatest promise. More recently, since 2003, Latin America has enjoyed a new era of economic progress and robust growth combined with price stability. There has been average annual economic growth of 4.7% since 2003, the highest growth recorded since the 1970s, and a noticeable decline in absolute poverty in many countries, despite persistent inequities across the region. In contrast to the post-war era and this recent progress, a review of Latin America's longer-term performance portrays a region that has essentially been stagnant between the 1980s and the early 2000s. In this period, Asia's newly industrialized economies, the NICs, grew at a much faster rate than Latin America. Consider the following facts. First, Latin America's share of global GDP has remained stagnant since 1965, and the income level has similarly not converged with that of the advanced economies. Second, the ups and downs of Latin America's importance in the world economy has been based on the cycles of commodity prices rather than reflecting sustained, self-generated development. In the past, Brazil and Mexico were each 1/3 larger than China, yet today, China is almost 50% larger than all of Latin America combined. Perhaps the single most troublesome longer-term issue is that Latin America suffers from the greatest disparities of income, even greater than in Africa. There are a number of striking differences between East Asia and Latin America. For one, East Asia has seen major gains in total factor productivity, while Latin American countries have remained stagnant. They have much higher savings and investment rates. They've placed much greater emphasis on human development and on meritocracy in their education systems, and produce a significantly higher number of engineers, scientists, and doctors. Also, East Asia's public and private investment in infrastructure has been much higher, and they have much more open economies. Finally, East Asia has restructured to become the manufacturing hub of the world, while Latin American economies remain highly dependent on commodities and agricultural products. The inability of the Latin American economies to further close the productivity and income gap with developed countries suggests that the region has become mired in the middle-income trap. Many of the region's economies have achieved middle-income status, but risk becoming trapped without a viable high-growth strategy. In many countries, wages are too high to be globally competitive in basic manufacturing. The collapse of Latin America's garments producers after protection was withdrawn is proof of that. Yet, Latin America does not have the research and development capabilities that would allow it to develop new products in advanced areas. The region is thus unable to compete with advanced economies in high-skill innovations. How would Latin America look in 2040 if the low growth trend of the recent past were to persist? Under the business-as-usual scenario, Latin America would grow at about 4% a year and less than 3% on a per capita basis. The region's share in world GDP would decline from about 7% now to 5%, and its per capita income in 2040 would fall well below the average for the world. Most likely, these conditions could exacerbate the law and order situation and lead to elevated levels of social unrest and crime. This scenario is presumably unacceptable to the region's political, social, business, and intellectual leadership and to its citizens at large. On the other hand, what would be the economic and social outlook of the region should it manage to cut its current differential with East Asia and China and India by half and lift its growth to about 6.5% a year between now and 2040? The region's economy by 2040 would be 4 times its current size. Its share of global GDP would rise to 10%, restoring the region to its position as one of the most prosperous developing regions, and the region would sharply reduce poverty within 20 years. 3 million people could be lifted out of poverty every year. The region's leaders and public must embrace and strive to achieve a more equitable and prosperous Latin America. To succeed, all concerned, governments, bureaucracy, the business community, academia, think tanks, media, and other opinion makers, as well as multilateral agencies active in the region, must aim much higher, be pragmatic, and focus single-mindedly on achieving this vision. Asia's success demonstrates that Latin America needs to pursue a more pragmatic and non-ideological set of policies that reflect a balance between market principles and government intervention, while respecting the principles of good governance and transparency, and with a good understanding of the costs. The vision and a commitment to realizing it must be shared across the region and should seek to take advantage of complementarities between individual economies for effective integration with the rest of the world. Latin American countries are so diverse in their natural endowments and in structural and institutional capacities that detailing a strategy for this vision is only possible at the level of each individual country. However, considering past experience and learning from the example of Asia, it is possible to define the central principles all countries must adopt. This broad strategy comprises 3 complementary pillars: more inclusion, higher productivity, and greater competition and openness within Latin America and towards the world. Importantly, actions under these 3 pillars will need to be underpinned by improved governance and accountability for results. Latin America has recently made important strides in improving the conditions of its poor. Nonetheless, significant numbers of Latin Americans, Indigenous Americans, Afro-Americans, and women are not fully integrated into the mainstream economy. Income and wealth distribution remains highly skewed. The current situation is unsustainable over the long term. Tackling structural inequalities is therefore essential from the point of view of equity, and is equally relevant to sustaining growth over the longer term. The fundamental approach to achieving a more inclusive society in the region will involve providing access to quality education and other public services, breaking the economic dominance by entrenched vested interests, and ensuring jobs and finance to those who are today left at the margins of society. At the same time, Latin America must pay much more attention to the looming problems of environmental degradation, rising crime, and corruption. The key to achieving a higher growth rate on a sustainable basis and converging with the developed economies lies in a sharply enhancing productivity and competitiveness of Latin American economies. This will require much more emphasis on improved human capital, a better business environment, much higher investment rates necessary to restructure the production of goods and services, and more entrepreneurship, innovation, and technological development. The third pillar is the promotion of much greater competition, both in internal markets and from trade. Latin American countries must give the highest priority to enhancing domestic competition, starting with dismantling of monopolies, whether public or private, and enforcement of well-structured competition laws. In parallel with measures to enhance domestic competition, Latin American economies must also promote much greater openness in the region and with the world, continued diversification of export markets beyond North America and Europe, including closer links with fast-growing Asia, diversification of export products beyond the dominance of commodities and fuels, and dismantling of remaining barriers to investment and trade with the global economy. These measures can be a powerful vehicle to curb the current monopolistic power of large companies, to increase competition at all levels, and to spur innovation. A closer look at each and every crucial issue facing the region reveals that the most underlying problems are rooted in poor governance. Without fundamental improvements in governance, it will not be possible to tackle these issues effectively. Specifically, Latin America must transform the following 8 facets of governance in order to realize the ambitious vision. 1. Make economic and social development the primary focus of policy. 2. Strengthen democratic institutions. 3. Decentralize, where possible, both the authority and accountability for most public services to local bodies. 4. Modernize and make more effective all institutions involved in economic management. Leaders must remain mindful of the lessons of the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009 and ensure that private markets operate within well-formulated regulatory frameworks and are supervised by competent authorities. 5. Reform the civil service to meet the needs of modern economies and of inclusive societies. 6. Improve the quality, honesty, and credibility of all public services, including the police, judiciary, education, and health services. 7. Prevent capture of state organs by big business and other vested interests. 8. Inculcate a code of self-discipline and ethical behavior within the business community. The payoff from achieving this scenario is huge. Under the shared vision, Latin America's GDP would reach $24.7 trillion versus $8.5 trillion. Its share of global GDP would reach 13.4% versus 5.1%, and its per capita income would reach $35,000 versus only $12,000. Millions of Latin Americans would be lifted out of poverty. Importantly, future generations would benefit from a much greater sense of optimism and commitment to shared prosperity, providing sustained social cohesion and peace in the region. Latin America can achieve this vision and must. By aspiring to more rapid economic growth and to a reduction of inequalities, the region can enter into a new era of hope and prosperity. Latin America's future is in its own hands.